All right, joining me for our first episode of Cobbled Together for the year is my good friend Kristy Perano. Kristy, welcome to the show and Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Thanks for having me.
So, you want to talk about the big event from this past year, past week?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so Biden gave a press conference. It was his, I believe, longest ever press conference. I actually read it might actually have been the longest press conference ever given by a sitting president at about just under 2 hours, I think.
Yeah, and I think kind of in response to criticism that he's been largely unavailable.
Also, that he's old and senile, that he wanted to prove, hey, I'm not senile. A senile person would have wandered off the stage aimlessly over an hour ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but over the course of the press conference, like it had its moments, but I mean, it was. I think I had people in my feed who were liking it. Sarah Igsur. I don't know if I'm actually pronouncing her name right. Igsur. She works for the Dispatch. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think I've seen her name before.
Yeah. Yeah. She was kind of praising the press conference, but those particular moments that we are going to talk about, um, yeah, those stood out, and those are the ones that are being looped, and the ones that we're going to talk about as well, because it's relevant to the sort of thing that we focus on, which is foreign policy as well as election integrity. Those are issues that are both important to us, right, Kristy?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I think let's I guess talk about the first clip that I guess we'd like to show you is because it's about the central focus of the show, which is Afghanistan. So it is therefore useful, I think, to just because of who we are, we're going to start with this one. And it's for the just to give some context, we have been on the show have been very critical about the way Biden handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And he was asked about this, like, I guess he had this to say, but let's check it out.
Deep questions among Americans about the
Better?
competence of
Yeah.
government. From the messy rollout of 5G this week to the Afghanistan withdrawal to testing on COVID, what have you done to restore Americans' faith in the competence of government? And are you satisfied by the view of the competence of your government?
Look, let's take Afghanistan. I know you all would like to focus on that, which is legitimate. We were spending $1 trillion a week. $1 billion a week in Afghanistan for 20 years. Raise your hand if you think anyone was going to be able to unify Afghanistan under one single government. It's been the graveyard of empires for a solid reason. It is not susceptible to unity, number one. So the question was, do I continue to spend that much money per week in the state of Afghanistan, knowing that the idea that being able to succeed, other than sending more body bags back home, is highly, highly unusual. My dad used to have an expression. He'd say, son, if everything's equally important to you, nothing's important to you. There is no way to get out of Afghanistan after 20 years easily. Not possible, no matter when you did it. And I make no apologies for what I did. I have a great concern for the women and men who were blown up on the line at the airport by a terrorist attack against them. But the military will acknowledge, and I think you will, who know a lot about foreign policy, that had we stayed and I had not pulled those troops out, we would be asked to put somewhere between 20 and 50,000 more troops back in. Because the only reason more Americans weren't being killed than others is because the last president signed an agreement to get out by May the 1st. And so everything was copacetic. Had we not gotten out, And the acknowledgement is we'd be putting a lot more forces in. Now, do I feel badly what's happening as a consequence of the incompetence of the Taliban? Yes, I do. But I feel badly also about the fistulas that are taking place in Eastern Congo. I feel badly about a whole range of things around the world that we can't solve every problem. And so I don't view that as a competence issue. The issue of whether or not there's competence in terms of
Okay, stop. That was a pretty Trumpian answer, right? Wasn't it? Ain't it?
Yeah, it's like I'm not responsible for the things I did and the consequences of my actions.
Yeah, and it's like, I shed more tears, for those who, the soldiers who died than the Afghans. Like, he essentially said something along those lines, right?
Right. He doesn't even mention like 100,000 Afghans that were promised a pathway to the US and just left behind to starve and get murdered by the Taliban. He doesn't even mention those. He mentions that he feels bad. He doesn't even talk about the like more than 2,000 veterans that died over the last 20 years. He only talks about the few that were killed in the airport bombing, or at least that seems like what he's talking about. It's also full of lies in terms of like what he's saying about Afghanistan policy, the situation before and after the withdrawal. He says, well, no one can unify Afghanistan. Well, Afghanistan was being governed by a single government for the last several years, and it was not 20 to 50,000 troops. It was, for a long time, it was sub 10,000.
It was only like 2,500, in fact, by the end.
Right, but the 2,500 was after the peace agreement with the Taliban, which the Taliban did cut back on targeting. They didn't completely stop, but they did cut back on targeting U.S. troops for the last year and a half. So it is so for the people that say, oh, well, it's, everything was great for the last year. We only had 2,500 troops there, and we only lost like 5 or I don't remember if it was like 5 or 10 or something. It was a pretty low number. But it is true to say that was not going to be long-term sustainable, because if the U.S. had, like the Taliban did exercise some self-control and not targeting U.S. troops as much. So if the U.S. had just said, well, look, we're not going to pull out of Afghanistan until the Taliban follows their end of the Doha deal, or try to withdraw from the Doha agreement, and then the Taliban would have increased targeting of U.S. troops. That is accurate. But to claim that we would then have to send back 20 to 50,000 troops, that's just a number he completely pulled out of thin air. Like it had been a long time since we had 20 to 50,000 troops, and even without having even a long time before the Doha agreement, most of Afghanistan was under control of the Afghan government, and the U.S. had like 7,000 troops or so for quite some time. So there's no justification for saying that we needed these like 20 to 50,000 troops. And I think it's just a total, he doesn't even mention the U.S. allies he's leaving behind. It's a total abdication of moral responsibility. And to equate Afghanistan to any other world, like sad world situation, well, we haven't, whoever's suffering in the Congo, they were not promised for the last 20 years that if they, if they risk their life in support of our mission, they were going to get a visa to the US. And we have like tens of thousands of Afghans that have had unlawful delays on their visas. And the Biden administration they have increased staffing in the State Department, but because of the huge influx of people applying for these visas, it's actually slowed down instead of sped up overall. So you have at least 60,000 people that have been waiting for an unlawfully long time for their visas, and there's just no mention of that. And I also think it's kind of classic victim blaming too. I mean, we were providing logistics for the Afghan army. We had no realistic plan for how they could take over logistics on that short of notice. And then when we stop providing logistics, everything collapses. And then we say, oh, gee, these Afghans just can't get their act together. And I mean, that's just victim blaming. Like, we set them up to fail. And then we said, oh, gee, look at this. You failed when we set you up to fail. So, I mean, I think that's just an incredibly callous answer, just completely washing his hands of any moral responsibility.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think that the this president who withdrew from Afghanistan the way they did, I think has no right to talk about it as if it's any sort of success story, because I think it's anything but. But
Right, and if he had heeded if his administration had heeded the pleading of advocates for months, they could have had, and it's like, oh, well, there was no way to get out of Afghanistan better than what we did. And yeah, they did fly a lot of people out at the end of August. But still, advocates have been calling for months prior to August saying that you need to evacuate SIVs, and they just ignored or came up with misleading excuses for why they couldn't do that. And then they waited until everything collapsed, and then they started trying to evacuate people. And by that time, it was complete chaos. Like, they ended up evacuating people that had some electric bill with English, and they convinced somebody that that was a document to prove they worked for the US. And so like a lot of the 60,000 or so people that were evacuated in August and brought into US custody, a good portion of them were genuinely at risk. Some of them were SIVs. A lot of them were citizens and American citizens and residents and their family members. And there were a number of them that were like Afghan special forces. So not to say that all the people evacuated were not at risk, because I think the majority of them were at risk, but it was a completely chaotic evacuation, and they ended up with a lot of people who should not have been evacuated, and a lot of very high risk people that were left behind. And the Taliban was the one providing the security. So some of the people that were the highest risk, the Taliban just be like, no, we're not letting you through. And the US did nothing to deal with that either. I mean, the whole time the Taliban was like beating people and blocking them, and people that were supposed to be on the list, like actually on manifest for charter flights, that could never get through the Taliban checkpoints. So it's just infuriating to me that the Biden administration like signed up tens of thousands of allies to be murdered or starved to death because they couldn't figure out how to evacuate the people they were supposed to be evacuating, and left 38 million people to face starvation at the hands of about 100,000 terrorists, and that are being supported by neighboring countries. And then tries to do a victory lap and saying, oh, well, we did a great job getting, we did all we possibly could. It's like, well, it was not a foregone conclusion that we had to leave Afghanistan. And if his administration had listened to advocates, then they would have started taking Afghan allies with them as they left, instead of leaving 100,000 or more people behind that we had promised protection to. So yeah, I find it very insulting to the American public that they continue to want to take a victory lap when it's well documented how much they messed up everything.
couldn't have said it better myself, Kristy. We're going to get to the Ukraine thing in a bit. I want to play, however, a comment. He said something about the 2022 election. Yeah, give me a second here. Forgive me, because this is the first time I think that we're really doing this sort of clip-by-clip analysis here. Hopefully I got into the right place here. Okay.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to clarify, a moment ago, you were asked whether or not you believed that we would have free and fair elections in 2022 if some of these state legislatures reformed their voting protocols. You said that it depends. Do you think that they would in any way be illegitimate?
Oh, yeah, I think it easily can be illegitimate. Imagine if, in fact, Trump has succeeded in convincing Pence to not count the votes. Imagine if...
In regards to 2022, sir, the midterm
Oh, 2022.
elections.
I mean, imagine if those attempts to say that the count was not legit. You have to recount it, and we're not going to count. We're going to discard the following votes. I mean, sure, I'm not saying it's going to be legit. It's the increase in the prospect of being illegitimate is in direct proportion to us not being able to get these reforms passed.
And there we go. That's it. Biden saying, unless we get the John Lewis Act passed, these elections are not going to be legit. Like Trumpian, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that both parties have flirted with the not certifying elections thing, and I think it was on a much larger, I think the Republicans did it on a much larger scale in 2020, like kind of trying to go with that, trying to undermine, trying to go with the narrative that we can't trust elections. That was, I think the Republicans did it on a larger scale in 2020 than Democrats had in the past. But I really think it's dangerous for democracy, actually, that both parties are engaging in the like, oh, well, if we don't get our way on elections, then they're not free and fair. And I think it's totally fine to criticize the current system and say these are reforms that are needed. I don't think that's a problem. But to say that if we don't get this particular, it's not legit if we don't get our bill passed, I think that's dangerous territory
Yeah.
for either party.
It's worth noting there is a contingent of the left that has never accepted the legitimacy of either of George W. Bush's elections. Not the one in 2000, not the one in 2004. You've had people like, I think, Jim Clyburn, Maxine Waters, who back in 2004 objected to the certification of Ohio's electoral votes because it was and I think Senator Barbara Boxer, I think, was of that opinion. But like, so there, it's the sort of thing that the Democrats have done in the past, but which Republicans just made famous and really took it to a big scale. But is what I'm saying making sense?
Yeah, no, and I agree. And so that's why when the Democrats are like, oh, this is just I mean, I was very opposed to the Republicans doing anything to undermine confidence in elections without presenting verified evidence that there was a problem. And if there were cases where at least there were like rumors of where, they continued counting votes and didn't let the observers in or whatever. I mean, I think at one point, I think there were some lawsuits that the Trump campaign did win, saying that you need to let the election observers observe like they're supposed to. So I'm not making a blanket statement that, anyone is wrong to criticize elections. If there's a case where election laws are not being followed, then absolutely the parties have a right to challenge that. But I mean, I was critical of the Republican Party just throwing out, the Trump campaign, and in some cases, the local Republican parties just throwing out a lot of allegations that oftentimes they didn't have good evidence for. But the Democrats that went like, oh, this is a shocking assault on democracy, this has never happened before. It's like, well, no, your own party has done the same thing, just not on as large of a scale and getting as much attention. And I mean, the Democrats haven't done the equivalent of January 6th, where you had people high up in the party pushing for not certifying the election. So I don't think it, so don't mean to undermine that, because that was a serious thing. But I think it's equally serious regardless of which party is doing it, to cast doubt on the legitimacy of election without verifiable evidence that there's a problem is really just a slippery slope, where eventually you could end up being like one of these Latin American countries or I mean, there's lots of countries that claim to have democratic elections, and in reality, like the books are all cooked and everybody knows that whoever won the election wasn't there. And basically, when people lose trust in the democratic process, then it ends up just becoming whoever has power wins elections instead of whoever actually was supposed to win the election wins elections. So that election integrity is a civic institution that is like the very backbone of having a democracy. And I think both parties are being irresponsible in undermining public confidence in that without having actually certified evidence that verifiable evidence that their allegations are true.
Yeah, no, I was watching sort of this Renew America had this this particular like talk about election integrity, and to me, the idea of election integrity, I think, encompasses like these various ideas that elections are secure, people show ID to vote, but it also, I think, a key part of election security is the idea that anyone who's a citizen should be allowed to vote and vote easily. Like in my opinion, one threat to election integrity would also be 7-hour lines in order to vote. Like, these stories you hear about hours long, lines at polling places. To me, that's just as much a threat to election integrity as is Russia actually changing votes, or a hacker changing votes, or anything like that.
Yeah, I agree. If it's not accessible, then you could, if there's a logistical problem, like people are not able to get to the polls, or they don't have, they don't want to take 7 hours off of work to wait in line, then that's a problem. But even, I think one thing that's interesting to note is that there's not like New York has some of the strictest voting laws in the country, and sometimes there's a lot of politics behind who gets criticized. So I do agree with you on that. And the Democrats tend to highlight that, oh, there were long lines at this or that Republican state, and not mention the Democratic states that might have even stricter voting laws. And I think there's also, Democrats tend to attack attempts to make people show ID at voting as like discriminating against minorities. And I actually saw a clip where minorities themselves said that, well, this is actually racist, which it kind of is. It's racist if you are saying that, well, gee, ethnic minorities are not going to be capable of getting an ID and remembering to bring it with them to go vote. It's like, and they actually had white people saying that, well, yeah, because they're not even going to have access to the internet or be able to fill out a form, so we can't have voter ID. And then they asked some Black people about that, and they were like, well, this is nonsense. Like, I am just as capable of getting on the internet and filling out a form as any white person is. So it ends up being an interesting dynamic. And what's frustrating to me is I don't feel like either party is really trying to make voting accessible, but also secure. It's like the Democrats are often against an ID requirement, which is like, why would you be against that? I think if there is an ID requirement, obviously it needs to be accessible and affordable. If it's like, oh, well, gee, if you don't have a passport, you can't vote or whatever, well, then a lot of Americans don't have a passport if they're not an international traveler. Obviously, that would be really problematic. But like India has voter ID, and they just make it very accessible for people to get the ID. So
Although
yeah,
India has its own problems with elections, as well as sort of government and discrimination in general. That India has its own problems with that right now.
yeah. Yeah, but I think it's frustrating to me that I don't feel like either party is really trying to back a system where, yes, we do have a rigorous check to make sure that the people who are voting are indeed American citizens, are registered to vote in that precinct, and are not voting elsewhere. But so, like, good security to make sure that we don't have people double voting or illegally voting, but also accessibility. And I think, the Republicans, I think, have weaponized the accessibility issue. And I have not like done a deep dive on the data, but I've seen claims that like Republicans in Texas and maybe also Georgia had kind of like, especially counties that had more Black people in Texas, tended to have fewer places to turn in absentee ballots, and just like unreasonably difficult to vote in some of these states, and possibly in an attempt to disenfranchise minority voters, which I think is a huge issue if there's an attempt to like systematically make it more difficult for a certain demographic to vote. But I'm equally bothered by in many cases, the Democrats' steadfast determination to not have voter ID. What I think it should be is look at an objective system, like a paper trail and verification of someone's ID, and make it accessible, like secure and accessible voting. That's what we should have. We should not have the people in power in a state able to discriminate against a certain population by putting fewer precincts in their district so that they have to wait in line for 7 hours and then they give up. That is not okay. But also tolerating security issues where people could potentially not be who they say they are, or to even not having a paper trail just does, even if it hasn't happened yet, it does lead itself to more potential security issues. So yeah, I find it frustrating that there's not more of a bipartisan effort to say what would a reasonable person, what can reasonable people agree on would be a way to improve election security and accessibility and try to implement those reforms. It seems to be a very partisan issue now.
You mentioned,
and like,
go ahead.
oh, and also, I mean, both parties decry gerrymandering and then they both engage in it. So there's like a lot of hypocrisy to go around on this,
Yeah.
on election issues.
You mentioned paper trails, and I just wanted to give an opportunity to plug my interview with Genya Coulter, that I did at the beginning of the year. That should be popping up probably on your screen right now when you watch this. So and go ahead and check it out if you feel like it. But I just want to say that I think that if we put aside like the usual partisan squabbles and partisan back and forth on things like voter fraud and voter suppression, I think there's more that people on the left and right agree with each other on than disagree on. Like I think there's broad consensus about accessible and secure elections that often gets lost in the partisan bickering. I really think it does.
Yeah, I would agree. But I think the unfortunate thing is that neither of the last two administrations, or I mean, I guess arguably even prior to that, have really been trying to focus on what can we do in a bipartisan manner, even when there is significant agreement. I feel like for the last several years, the extremists in both party have held too much sway over the agenda, and things that could have been common sense compromises have been victim to no one wanted there's too many people on both bases that simply do not want compromise, and I think that's unfortunate because it's really kind of like held it's kind of like held bipartisan reforms hostage because there's too many special interests in both parties that would rather not do anything than compromise and get something done because that would involve compromising.
Right. Yeah, no, but there's now focus hopefully on reforming, I think, the most important part of this whole thing, which is the Electoral Count Act. You're probably well aware of that whole issue. I don't have to go into that, but it's probably the whole reason, as Eric Cunningham said, it's probably the whole reason why January 6th even happened. So it's great that they're going to reform that.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get to the grand finale of the Biden press conference, and that is the wonderful remarks that he made on Ukraine. Let's play that for you right now.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to follow up on your answer there about Russia and Ukraine. When you were in Geneva in June, you said to us about President Putin, I think the last thing he wants now is a Cold War. Now, since then, of course, you've seen him gather these troops, 100,000 troops around Ukraine. Your Secretary of State said today he thought he could invade it at any moment. You've seen the cyber attacks, and you've seen the demand that he have a sphere of influence in which you would withdraw all American troops and nuclear weapons from what used to be the Soviet bloc. So I'm wondering if you still think that the last thing he wants is a Cold War. And has your view of him changed in the past few months? And if it has, and he does invade, would your posture be to really move back to the kind of containment policy that you saw so often when you were still in the Senate?
The answer is that I think he still does not want any full-blown war, number one. Number two, do I think he'll test the West, test the United States and NATO as significantly as he can? Yes, I think he will. But I think he'll pay a serious and dear price for it that he doesn't think now will cost him what it's going to cost him. And I think he'll regret having done it. Now, whether or not, I think that, how can I say this? a public forum. I think that he is dealing with what I believe he thinks is the most tragic thing that's happened to Mother Russia, in that the Berlin Wall came down, the empire has been lost, the near abroad is gone, etc. The Soviet Union has been split. But think about what he has. He has 8 time zones, a burning tundra that will not freeze again naturally, a situation where he has a lot of oil and gas, but he is trying to find his place in the world between China and the West. And so I'm not so sure that he has David, I'm not so sure he is certain what he's going to do. My guess is he will move in. He has to do something. And by the way, I've indicated to him the 2 things he said to me that he wants guarantees on. One is Ukraine will never be part of NATO. And 2, that NATO or there will not be strategic weapons stationed in Ukraine. Well, we can work out something on the second piece, pretending what he does along the Russian line as well, the Russian border and the European area of Russia. On the first piece, we have a number of treaties internationally and in Europe that suggest that you get to choose who you want to be with. But the likelihood that Ukraine is going to join NATO in the near term is not very likely, based on much more work they have to do in terms of democracy and a few other things going on there.
We are helping Mother Russia. Putin's waited far too long. What was that? Pardon the singing.
Yeah, very. It sort of seems like the way he talks about the Soviet Union, it's as if it just like collapsed a year or 2 ago. I mean, it doesn't. It sounds like, yeah, it really. If you didn't know this was in 2022, you would think this was like 20 years ago that this clip was played. It's like, oh, Putin is really. Yeah, and yeah, it's just bizarre that like, how did he call Mother Russia? I mean, he's not. As far as I know, he's not from Russia. Like, where did that even come from?
Yeah, no, and Ukraine like saw that clip. I have a feeling that when that press conference happened, somebody woke up Putin in the middle of the night, and like RT employees were called into work like at 2 a.m. just to report on that clip. Yeah, and Putin watched.
Even Trump never called it like Mother Russia. And also it's sort of like, oh well, Putin said that he doesn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO, and the good news is it won't be, like, not for a long time. And it's like, why would a US president be saying that? And he was like, oh, I need to think about what I can even say in a public forum. It's like he's, I guess, trying to not disclose. I don't know if he's trying to like not disclose classified information, or if he's just like trying to like not stick his foot in his mouth. But obviously the like not stick his foot in his mouth didn't exactly happen. And then he did I think the worst part of that was just him saying that, well, like he has to do something, he has to invade Ukraine. And it's like, why are we not talking about how, like, shouldn't you be at least projecting confidence? I mean, even if you are privately telling people that, like, yeah, we're not really going to do anything. I mean, should you be like in front of the entire world saying, oh yeah, by the way, we ran away from Afghanistan because we don't like fighting, and we're really going to do nothing about any dictator wanting to, you know, take over. And then it wasn't in that clip, but he did. He also elsewhere said that since, you know, no nuclear power had invaded anyone since World War II, which is really not true. For one thing, Russia has been invading Ukraine for the last 8 years.
And Russia also invaded all those countries as part of the Soviet Union, so, and everything since, so. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I mean, even the U.S. can't say we haven't invaded anybody. I mean, like the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, so it's really I mean, not to say that those weren't justified. I mean, there's the question of like, were they smart things to do? Were they justified? Which are obviously slightly different questions. But even from the U.S.'s own behavior, just to say that, oh well, the nuclear powers have never invaded anybody since World War II. I mean, that's just completely not true. It's not true of Russia. It's definitely not true of Russia. It's not even true of the U.S.
Yeah, and Ukraine saw, like, I'm talking about Putin getting woke up in the middle of the night to just to watch that clip on RT. I have a feeling that Vladimir Zelensky also had trouble sleeping that night after he saw that clip.
Yeah, I mean, he's been. I don't remember if it was after that he did issue some statement, maybe after that, about how he's still confident of the US or whatever, but yeah, I think that's very troubling, and it kind of goes to show how the Biden administration actually touted leaving Afghanistan as a way to like effectively combat China. And I do think like whether the US leaving Afghanistan is a win for China is a complex question. It's not. I mean, there are some people that are quick to say that, oh, it's a big win for China, and I think generally speaking it is, but in that it kind of like just makes the US look weak and like a bad ally, and that obviously anything that weakens US image like helps our adversaries. But the people that are like, oh yeah, now China's going to be like mining lithium and making all this money in Afghanistan, like Afghanistan is kind of, even Pakistan has like had run-ins with the Taliban in Afghanistan, so Afghanistan is kind of a tiger by the tail situation, even for like China and Pakistan and other countries that like, I mean, Pakistan aided the Taliban taking over Afghanistan, but now the Taliban is really full themselves. So they're like in there like raising the border fences between them and Pakistan, because they want like part of Pakistan that was supposed to be part of Afghanistan that's still Pakistan, and this sort of thing. So I think anyone that's like, oh, this geopolitical issue is a clear win for this or that, is usually these things are more complex than that. But it's still just, the whole Ukraine situation just underscores how the Biden administration touted leaving Afghanistan as like strengthening our position on the world stage, because we don't have this like sink here in Afghanistan. But I think it's been completely the opposite. It just like makes us look like we're gonna turn tail and run, and abandon our allies and whatever. We just want to avoid war at all costs, and that's just not that anyone wants an unnecessary war, but if you just like convince the world that no matter what you will not ever fight, then you're not a superpower anymore. You're just another country that wants to buy cheap stuff from China and doesn't care how bad the rest of the world is. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's coincidence that Russia and also China are flexing their muscles now after the Biden administration just turned tail and ran on Afghanistan.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at. I remember seeing some news updates that apparently before I don't know if the United States is deploying any troops to the Ukrainian border. Canada certainly is. We've sent troops to the Canadian border. I think the Dutch
The Ukrainian border, you mean?
Yeah,
The
so
Ukrainian border, you mean?
yeah. Sorry, what did I say?
You said you sent troops to the Canadian border.
Yeah, no.
I think we're still on better terms. Our countries are still on better terms than that. We don't have a militarized border yet.
Yeah, no, for sure.
I mean, someday maybe Americans will all be trying to immigrate en masse to Canada, and you guys will like militarize.
Or you guys are going to invade us for our fresh water. No, but we've sent troops to the Ukrainian border. I believe the Dutch have. I believe the UK has. I believe the only ones who haven't are the United States and Germany.
Yeah, which I think is just a disgrace. It's like the U.S. claims to be the leader of the free world, and we're just like completely AWOL on everything now. And I do think that Europe and Canada could have exercised a lot more leadership with respect to Afghanistan than they have, even in the subsequent months. Canada has, like, actually proportionally, I think, has taken more Afghans than most other countries in terms of, like, NATO allied Afghans.
Yeah, and I think Canada
Um,
has the most generous refugee policy per capita, I think, of any country.
Yeah. So I think Canada should get credit where credit is due for that. But like, and Canada was there as part of the evacuation, but then at one point Justin Trudeau was like, oh, we're gonna stay till we get everyone out that we need to get out. And then, like, the next day, Canada, like, slinked out of the evacuation before the US was even, Canada left before the US even left, in terms of the August evacuation. And Germany and Italy, like, strongly criticized the US withdrawal, and the UK as well, which I think they were right to do that. I completely agree with them criticizing the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. But also, it's like, if you are the UK or Germany or Italy, you were in a position to do something other than complain about the US. I mean, those countries could have said, look, the US has been leading the charge in Afghanistan for 20 years, and we will now lead the charge to enforce the Doha Agreement, and say, look, Taliban, all of us in the West are not going to bug off until you start keeping the promises you made in Doha. And nobody, but the Taliban is like, oh, we have this agreement. It'd be like if I agreed to sell you a car for 5,000 and then you never paid me, but I said, oh, we had an agreement, so I still had to give you the car. Well, no, the Taliban had an agreement. They didn't keep their end of the deal. The US and the West was under no obligation to leave Afghanistan if we were the only ones keeping our end of the deal. And a lot of countries that I think, rightfully criticized the US for bugging out of Afghanistan, but then they ultimately bugged out of Afghanistan too. And I think I think Germany has done a little better job at evacuating people than the US has, but also they had, like, fewer people to evacuate. But anyway, I mean, I'm disappointed by even though I think that the US has done a terrible job of leadership on these issues, I'm also disappointed by especially Germany and as well as other countries. I think the UK has done a better job of standing up to Putin, obviously, than Germany, but Germany has been, like, leading the whole like softball Putin stuff.
Germany has
So
never been a stand up to Putin country. They're going through with Nord Stream 2. They, like, their government that shut down all their nuclear power plants. They've been getting all their natural gas from Russia ever since. Germany has never been the ones to step up when it comes to Russia.
yeah, and I think ultimately every country is responsible for their own bad decisions. So the US doesn't get to blame Germany's lack of leadership, but I'm, like, sorely disappointed in Germany's lack of leadership, as well as the US's lack of, willingness to just put Putin in his place. And obviously I'm not rooting for a hot war. I don't think anybody is, but if the West is just gonna always appease, it's like that could never go wrong, like just appeasing letting dictators in Europe, like, take over everything they want, like that, that could never go wrong.
Like is Biden's, like, move towards not stepping up to Ukraine or stepping up to defend Ukraine? Is that what they call it? Peace in our time?
Yeah, and it's just like, oh, well, we want to avoid conflict, so we're just gonna let Putin do what he wants. And, like, how well did that work out last time we appeased the wannabe European dictator?
Yeah.
So I think that part of the problem is, like, I feel like our generation takes peace and prosperity for granted because we've grown up. If you grew up in the West, like, and you're in your 20s or 30s, pretty much your whole life has been, like, more or less peace and prosperity. I mean, I have, like, some of my first, like, extremely vague memories are of the Persian Gulf War. But, like, so the whole time, so, like, not that there have been no conflicts abroad, but, like, if you were not in the military, you've never wondered if your, like, home country was going to survive this or that war. It's just like, it's been a period of peace and prosperity. And I just feel like we take it for granted that, there will be, like, yes, there's inflation and recessions and things like that, but I think we just take it for granted that we will have, relative peace and prosperity forever. And I mean, we have a lot of like really bad foreign policy, and also I would say pretty irresponsible fiscal policy going on. And all these things are ticking time bombs. And eventually, our decisions are going to catch up with us. We can't keep printing more money and not, and not paying back our debts. And we also can't keep just appeasing every, strong man in the world and not ever have to pay back for that. So I do feel like I feel like the trend is away from democracy and human rights now, because it just feels like, the countries that are supposed to be defending those are kind of retreating and just dealing with domestic problems, retreating from the world stage. And there are plenty of freedom loving people, but but it just seems like the more autocratic countries are strengthening their position. And I think China has its own issues, I mean, including demographics, and their like plummeting birth rate. And I think Russia also has a low birth rate. So there are issues that I'm not saying that China is going to be like a world dictator here in a few years. I don't believe that either, but I feel like the US and other Western countries are just voluntarily retreating from any like effective policies to combat autocrats. And I find that very concerning, along with our domestic trend toward, less and less functional institutions and more partisan drama, which just takes away from our ability to have an effective government and to actually like ever solve political problems or work together.
Great way to sum up everything we've talked about, Kristy. Partisan squabbles at home, dictators abroad. On the whole, not feeling optimistic about what's going to happen in the future, but we're going to keep on it. Before we go, Kristy, you want to say something about the groups in Afghanistan that you're helping out? You want the audience to know about?
Yeah, so I mean, I've talked about this in past episodes, but I have, several friends, some Americans, some Kurdish Americans, and there's also an Afghan woman that's probably going to be an Afghan American woman who's probably going to be joining us. And we have the called KANA, the Kurdish Alliance of North America, and even though we were founded to like promote to support Kurdish allies, we've recently been helping Afghan allies, including and a lot of we're not a big enough organization to be doing evacuation flights, but we are just providing sustenance and also like casework help for Afghan allies that are stuck in Afghanistan. So and there are some of the organizations have people on the ground, and for anywhere from $65 to like $120, you can send a food package to a family which will support them for like 3 to 5 weeks, depending on the size of the family. So there's a huge need. Like 95% of Afghans are facing extreme poverty, and like many of them at risk of starvation. And there is some movement towards governments providing more humanitarian aid, but some of that is not even going to be able to reach the people that truly need it, which are the ones that are in hiding. So it's basically just everyday Americans that have been spending their savings trying to keep Afghan allies alive and try to get them to safety. So yeah, if anyone is inclined to donate, it is a huge overwhelming tragedy, but there are actually things that you can do if you donate. I mean, you can donate money for food and sustenance for Afghan allies, and some evacuations are supposed to be starting again soon. So I mean, more of these people will be getting out to safety, but in the meantime, we do have to help them survive.
Yeah. So I'll have the links down in the description below, and please go check them out, and be sure to help the organizations to the extent that you're able to. Kristy, thank you so much for coming on tonight. Want to have you back as always to keep talking about this.
Your internet seems to be very slow.
Really? Is it really?
Yeah, I can't hear anything, and it's just like, he's kind of lurching around.
Well, of course you can't hear anything. I didn't share sound. Well, let's try that again, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't we actually try it, but with not fail?
The Afghanistan with President Biden on the
I want to thank my communications staff for the great help here.
Well, President Biden, on the coronavirus, we're tragically approaching nearly 1 million Americans.
Give me a
who
second
died.
here.
And I've been with.
Yes.
Mr. President, I would like to ask you about foreign policy. One of the first priority that you declared when you came to office was to end the war in Yemen.
If you think I
Your cognitive fitness. Thank you.
involved to do it, and it's going to be very difficult.
We will be right back when we find that clip. And we found the clip. We're back, and let's talk about what he said about the 2022 election. Play.